Johnson, and I am a researcher here at the Academy of Sciences. Today we are going to talk about the Farallone Islands. The Farallone Islands are a set of islands about 28 miles west of San Francisco. They're actually part of San Francisco proper. And initially when we planned this event, we were going to be talking live to biologists on the island, because there are biologists that do work on the island. And they're always there. They're there every day of the year. And we had a team of intertidal biologists, the people that work in the tide pools, in the places where that are exposed during low tide and covered with water at high tide, that were on their way out there. And we were going to talk live with them from the island. But they had a series of mishaps and weather-related problems, so they're actually here today. So we're going to chat about the island and the research that goes on the island and what it's like to live and work on the island with them here. Behind us, you can see this is a live stream from the island. The Academy has a webcam that is perched on top of the lighthouse that you can go online and you can see a live stream from that webcam anytime from your computer. You can actually control the camera also, so you can zoom around and see different parts of the island. So this is a view of the island right now. So it was raining earlier. It's kind of about the same weather, maybe a little cooler, a little foggier out there compared to what it's like here today. So my name's Rebecca again, and then the two folks I have sitting here are Jan Roletto, the research coordinator from the Gulf of the Farallones National Marine Sanctuary, one of the intertidal biologists who would have been out on the island, and Carol Preston, who's the education coordinator from the Gulf of the Farallones National Marine Sanctuary. She's been out to the island lots of times and will add to our conversation about the islands. All right, so first let's hear about the trip to the island and how their trip went awry and what happened in the effort to get out to the island. So Jan, maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, Rebecca. So as research coordinator at the sanctuary, it's my job to pull together teams of people to do all sorts of monitoring. We have estuaries, we have rocky intertidal, we have deep ocean, we have bird and mammal types of monitoring programs in the sanctuary. So this week we have a really good series of minus tides out at the Farallone Islands, and so we've scheduled this trip like 6 months in advance. So we all know that time and tide wait for no one, including rocky intertidal biologists. We tried last Wednesday to go out to the islands, and we were weathered out. Basically, large swells, the prelude to a storm event was coming in. So we waited till the next day. The next day, we went out on a boat, and you have to go from a big boat to a little boat to actually get onto the island. The island doesn't have a dock, but it does have a little platform where we can take all of our gear, and we have about 1,200 pounds of actual gear and food for the entire week. That includes all of our wetsuits, all of our dry gear, all of our bedding, as well as all of our food. And so we got the majority of our gear onto the island, as well as one of our intertidal biologists. It's a team of 4. And then the swells came in, picked up the boat, broke the prop, and after that, the boat was disabled. And everybody is safely on the island, that is on the island, as well as all of our gear. And so we, for the past half of a week and a half, we had one intertidal biologist. He continued to do monitoring. He borrowed one of the elephant seal biologist team members, and so that he's very safe in the rocky intertidal. He's not down there by himself, and he right now is looking for endangered black abalone, and he actually found 2 endangered black abalone that we hadn't seen in previous years. So we've been doing this monitoring project for 20 years. This is the 3rd time in 20 years that I have not been able to get on the island. This is the first time that half of my team is on the island and the other half could not get back onto the island at all. And so we have a lot of food here on the mainland that we're sharing with our colleagues at our various workplaces. And Gary's out there actually doing getting ready to do some monitoring this afternoon.
Wow. So if you guys understood that there are no docks or anywhere to land normally on the island. So there are a couple different ingenious ways of getting on the island, but none of them include a big boat pulling up to the island and docking. So the islands themselves are the Farallone National Wildlife Refuge. So access is strictly limited to only biologists that have permission from Fish and Game to do research out there. So not only is access prohibited for people that don't have permission, it's also very difficult even for people with permission to get on the island. And if weather and mechanical problems happen, it's almost impossible. So the folks that are on the island right now, the only way they can get any help or services or extra food right now is by a helicopter until this boat that broke the propeller is fixed. So they're super, super isolated. But when you are on the island, once you make it onto the island, it's actually really, really nice. There are two beautiful old houses that were built in the late 1800s to house the lighthouse keepers and their families, and that's where the biologists live. So Carol, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the houses and life on the island and what it's like when you live there.
Sure. It's actually really great to go back and stay in one of these houses. And I think it's the only research station that I've ever seen that really represents San Francisco really well. And the reason I say that is because the kitchen is fantastic. It has a wolf stove. You open the pantry and the spices are amazing. They have an Asian section and a Indian section. And so the food is fabulous out there for a research station. And it's really pleasant living. There's a nice little living room area, a kitchen, a place where we do all of our work. It's actually kind of fun. It's kind of like if you had a grandma or maybe a great-grandma and going to her house kind of way out in the country.
It is kind of like that. It feels really isolated, and it's great because the only things you have to do are field work, which in our case is totally determined by when the tide is low. So you have to do that, and then you have to make dinner. That's about it. So it's really nice, and your duties and what you have to do are really well delineated. So you do one thing, and then you do another thing, and it's really quite fun. So there are biologists out there now, aside from our Intertidal team, and the biologists out there right now are mostly studying elephant seals and elephant seal behavior and biology. The elephant seals are just kind of finishing up their rearing of their pups, and so right now you can see hundreds of elephant seals and thousands of other marine mammals. So maybe Jan, you can talk a little bit about the other marine mammals on the island and some of the other research that goes on the island.
Yes. Well, the island has a cycle, just like we have seasons on the mainland. The island has its own seasons. So during the winter, we call it the elephant seal season, where the elephant seals come in early December. They give birth to these 100-pound pups, and they're weaned at 300 pounds, and all of the adults depart by March. So that's the elephant seal season. And then after that is the seabird season. And the seabird season lasts a bit longer. There's over 300,000 birds on the island during the seabird breeding season. There's 12, 13 species of breeding seabirds. It depends if you count a shorebird species as a seabird species. And after that comes what we call the landbird and the shark season. So the landbird season is during the early fall, late summer, where thousands of migratory songbirds, passerines, birds from China all land on the island. And there's been documented over 400 species of landbirds on the island, as well as shark season. Everybody knows about the white sharks that live out at the Farallone Islands, Bodega Head, Año Nuevo Island being called the Red Triangle, where they're feeding on all of the pinnipeds that come to the island. In some years, there's over 6,000 California sea lions on the island, 2,000 elephant seals on the island, about 100 harbor seals. And then there's a new colony of, relatively new colony of northern fur seals on the island. But the white sharks really prefer the elephant seals because they have a really thick layer of blubber, and they like feeding on things that have a lot of blubber on them. So the elephant seals, the 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds that are still kind of naive, but they're really, really fat. They also like to scavenge on the whale carcasses that are floating around the islands. And so they're really looking for that high fat content, whether it's a dead whale or it's an elephant seal.
Great. So the island, remember we said they're actually part of San Francisco. So the islands are part of San Francisco and also the largest seabird breeding colony south of Alaska. So like Jan said, over 300,000 seabirds breed basically within the city limits of San Francisco, which is kind of amazing to think about. And most people from San Francisco or visiting San Francisco have no idea that this is happening just a few miles off our coast. So the research that the intertidal biologists were setting out to do is really fascinating. And so I thought maybe we'd talk a little bit about the kind of research that we do in the intertidal. Most of the folks looking at marine mammals and birds spend a lot of time looking with binoculars and spotting scopes and counting things and monitoring their behavior. But for us, we're studying tiny invertebrates and algae and all of the diversity in the intertidal. So the methods that we use are quite a bit different. So maybe Jan and Carol, you guys can talk a little bit about how it works when we're doing our research.
Well, we have a 20-year data set from the Farallone Islands, and what that means is we monitor all of the algae, all of the invertebrates. We look at how many things are living on top of each other. So there is always more than 100% cover of algae and invertebrates in our sampling plots. It's very, very rich. It's very, very biodiverse in comparison to what we find in our tide pools on the mainland.
So what kind of animals, when you say inverts, what kind of animals are you talking about that we see in the intertidal?
Carol, can you pull out the mussels? So I'm not quite certain if you guys can see this online, but we have some California mussels. That's what these large things here. And these are actually about half the size of what you would find on the Farallone Islands. It's very, very pristine on the Farallone Islands. There's very few ways of predators. On the mainland, we have a lot of shore pickers and people walking on the intertidal, and that will cause animals to die or be crushed or be extracted. But on the Farallone Islands, the only things that eat these mussels are the black oyster catchers and the ruddy turnstones and the other shorebirds that live on the Farallone Islands or migrate through.
So that's true for many of the invertebrates on the island because there's no pressure from humans collecting them for food or for people visiting or for other birds. They grow much bigger. So mussels are a really good example. If you go to lots of the intertidal areas on the mainland, people have collected mussels to make cioppino or other soups, and it's legal to collect about 10 pounds a day with a fishing license of California mussels. But on the island, because no one visits, the mussels have a chance to grow a lot bigger and they're a lot more dense. And that's true for a few other species that we study. Is there any other species one of the species, I brought a couple shells of abalone. So most people know about abalone. It's a kind of snail, just highly prized delicacy. And there are two species found at the Farallone Islands, the red abalone, which is the really more common species that's collected for food north of the Golden Gate Bridge only. The red abalone is found intertidally on the Farallone Islands. And here on the mainland in tide pools, you can occasionally see a red abalone, but they're much more rare because they have been overfished by people taking them. Because the easiest place to get them is somewhere that's in the intertidal where you can just walk out when the tide is low and pick them. Now most people who fish for abalone do have to free dive in Mendocino County. It's the #1 place to get them. So the red abalone you can see intertidally on the islands. But even kind of more amazingly is there's another species of abalone. Well, there are a few other species of abalone found in California. But one, called the black abalone, was just recently listed as an endangered species. It's one of only 2 endangered marine invertebrates in California. So the black abalone is an endangered species, but it's found on the Farallone Islands. And I brought some shells. You can kind of see the difference. If you look at this one, it has these little holes here. You guys can hold it. And if you feel these holes, you can see how they're flush against the shell. There's nothing sticking out above the shell. Yeah, wait 1 second. Okay, sweetie. And if you look back at this red abalone, you can see that the holes in the shell are more like volcanoes. And they push up a little bit. So that's one of the ways that you can tell them apart. So some of the work that the one intertidal biologist that made it out to the island is doing right now is because the species, the black abalone, is endangered, we're really interested in finding out where it is in California. And so we're trying to figure out where it is so we can improve the habitat to help them recover. So he's out there looking for black abalone. Did you have a question, sweetheart? Okay. Right, so we're talking about how it's so beautiful, huh? So this young man in the audience is talking about the beautiful inside of the abalone shell, which many of us have seen in jewelry or buttons. This is actually secreted by the animal, so it's a snail that has a mantle that makes the shell, the entire shell. And this inside layer is called the nacreous layer. And all snails have some kind of shiny nacreous layer, but abalone is especially beautiful and are prized not only for their meat for eating, but also for the shell inside. I think, not 100% sure. The question was, which are bigger, the black or the red? So the red, in general, get bigger. The ones I have here, the black is bigger. The black get taller, a little bit taller, but they aren't as big. But some red abalone from like historic collections can be enormous. The limit for collecting abalone, red abalone, is 7 inches. That's still pretty big. Most of the abalone that they serve in restaurants now in California are reared in aquaculture, which is better for the wild populations. But they can be really big. And on our coast, we have about 6 species of abalone, which is more diversity than anywhere else in the world. And then we also have the biggest species. So although they have abalone in South Africa and parts of Australia, they're much, much smaller. So are there any other things you wanted to add about invertebrates from the Intertidal?
I was wondering, Kathy, if there was any chat questions. Not right now. Okay. So one of the other things that we look at, we use this long-term monitoring data in order to assess if there's a boat grounding or an oil spill. We use this information as what we call baseline. What were the conditions right before the oil spill or right before the boat grounding? And then we would go back to the intertidal after the boat is removed or after the oil is removed and see what damages had occurred. From there, we can say, okay, this is what it's going to cost oil company in order to restore or return the habitat to the condition that it was. And that's a very, very powerful tool. So we often use this type of information during, for example, the Costco Busan oil spill. We have monitoring sites. The Park Service has monitoring sites out at Alcatraz. And when the Costco Busan collided with the Bay Bridge and spilled oil in the bay, part of that intertidal area was damaged. And so we looked at Farallone Island data as pristine. This is untouched, unfettered type of habitat that is out there. So we use the Farallone Island information during oil spills. Even though oil may not have reached the Farallone Islands, this is the pristine condition.
Great. Does anyone have any questions about some of that research or anything else?
The question is, have we seen any changes in the conditions of the intertidal? One of the species that we actually monitor is a seagrass, and it's not an algae, it's actually a flowering plant, and we call it surfgrass. And surfgrass, we know where the surfgrass has been for the last 20 years. Where is it in relationship to zero tide level? And as we go into climate change and we have larger storm events and sea level rise, there's sea level rise, we can monitor that footprint, that march of that seagrass up higher and as the sea level rises. And the biodiversity is remarkable out there. It's one of the highest biodiverse areas along the California coast, but it doesn't change. It really doesn't change very much at all. You have basically the same mixture of species in the intertidal, as well as the same amount. And there might be storm events like El Niños or La Niñas that come in and take big pieces of the for example, the mussel beds might be ripped out by a large storm event, but it grows back incredibly fast. I think we have online some images of one of our sampling plots before, during, and after a large storm event came in and basically kind of cleared out a spot, and less than 6 months later, there was already mussels repopulating that area. You have another question?
There's a question from the online stream. So the question is, what is the biggest challenge of working on the Farallone Islands? Maybe, Carol, do you want to answer that?
I think maybe getting there is the big challenge. Even though it's in the same zip code as the Richmond district, it's pretty tough. So just the terrain is hard. But, once you're there, it's really beautiful.
Sure. So this is Rebecca again, and the one thing I would add, not just to getting there, is we do work rain or shine in the intertidal, regardless of the weather. So it can be really cold, it can be really windy, and it can be really rainy, and you still have to get out and go sit in like a really wet, storm surgy, rainy environment and look down in these really small squares and count tiny animals and tiny algae. No matter how long it takes. So that can be a challenge. And even though the houses are beautiful, they're not particularly warm. So, and you can't, because water is limited on the island, because water is all collected by rain catchment and stored, and biologists live there all the time. So if we're visitors for just a week, we can't go and take, tons of showers and waste all their water. So it can be really cold, and then when you come back to the house, sometimes it's difficult to get warm because you can't shower right away. So that's one of the things that I do, is do a lot of baking to keep the oven going and kind of heat up the house. So that's one of the challenges that I've had when we've been there.
This is Jan. I think one of our challenges is to have as little impact on the island as possible. We have to get to the intertidal zone, which means we have to pass by a lot of wildlife that's living and breeding on the island. So often we have to climb up and around some very steep granite inclines with all of our gear on our back. Sometimes we're wearing wetsuits, sometimes we're wearing chest waders, and it's a very, very strenuous hike. Even it's a relatively small island, but hiking to an area so that we have minimum impact, minimum footprint, a minimum disturbance to all the birds and mammals that are living, not necessarily in the intertidal, but between us, the houses, and the intertidal. We want to keep that at a minimum. I think we have another question.
Wow, so there are two questions, like what's the biggest mussel we've seen on the island? And I'd say probably about that big. And there can be areas that are called mussel beds. So the other question was how many mussels are there? And there can be areas that are almost all mussels, maybe like as big as this area where you are sitting on the chairs. But the most amazing thing is if you look, it looks like it's all mussels. But then if you look really closely, there are tons of other animals living on the mussels, living under the mussels. So we've had, Carol and I, one of the first times I was on the island, were looking at really closely at mussels, trying to count all the invertebrates and algae. And you could see maybe hundreds of other species all tucked into where the mussels live. Little worms, little starfish, lots of different little algae and little snails, and it's only by looking really, really closely that you can see those things. Another question from the audience. Kathy.
What is something about the islands that most San Franciscans don't know?
So what is something about the islands that most San Franciscans don't know?
Well, one of my favorite things is that there are salamanders that live out there. So
good.
maybe most people don't know about that. I didn't know about that. And crickets. And this particular salamander and cricket only live on those islands. They're endemic, so they're only found on those islands, which is pretty amazing for salamanders because they're really rocky area habitat for them. But they're beautiful little spotted creatures.
So the salamanders, it's thought that this is Rebecca again. So the salamanders, it's thought that they're very closely related to an arboreal salamander that's found here on the mainland. And it's thought that when sea level was lower, it was just kind of like marshy area between San Francisco and the Farallones, and that these salamanders could walk basically from the mainland to the island. And then when sea levels rose, this is about 10 to 12,000 years ago, when sea level rose and kind of filled in our bay and created the Farallone Islands, that those salamanders and crickets were isolated. So that's how they became the separate species or subspecies. There's a little bit of debate. So, yeah, Kathy.
How is the rodent problem there? I've heard you were working on the problem. Have you seen any?
So there's a question about the rodent problem on the island and about us working on it. And actually, none of us from the sanctuary or the academy work on the rodents at all. There are rodents on the island, house mice. And if you're interested in finding out more about the project that Fish and Game and PRBO Conservation Science is conducting, you can go online, and there's a website called Restore Farallones.org, and you can find out all the information about the mouse project they're doing. And I should mention, since I mentioned them, all of the biologists that live on the island full time, there are different crews: a winter crew, a spring and summer crew, and a fall crew. All of the folks that are out there work for PRBO Conservation Science, formerly known as the Point Reyes Bird Observatory, and they do all of the research out on the island, and they've been out on the island for over 40 years, every single day, doing research. So long-term monitoring, like they do and like we do, is really, really important for understanding the health of the island, and is the only way that we can look at and answer questions about change through time, about climate change, is having these long-term data sets. So it's because of the biologists that are there and Fish and Game who works with them to get them to the island. Fish and Wildlife, I'm so sorry. Fish and Wildlife that gets them to the island and provides all of the support and boat service and all of that stuff, and makes it really critical for the research that goes on there. Yeah.
So far, it's been.
Could you repeat the question, Jan?
Oh, to repeat the question, is our monitoring long term, or do we also do restoration? So, to answer the restoration question, yes and no. It really depends on what is actually damaged. Fortunately, in the last 20 years, we have not had to actually restore anything to the rocky intertidal area. But over the last 20 years, we have used that data for other spills on the mainland, with that information on the Farallone Islands representing pristine. Also, restoration activities take place year-round, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, part of the refuge system, the Farallone Islands are part of that refuge system, they do restoration for impacted species from those oil spills. And the majority of that has been seabirds. So they'll do restoration with the western gull, with the Brandt's cormorants, with the common murre. Some of those restoration projects could be redesigning the burrows, helping the burrowing seabirds be more accommodated, removing invasive species like the plants or the house mouse. Also, reducing, trying to reduce the amount of disturbance to seabirds, not just on the island, but also along the mainland colonies. So restoration is very active. Fortunately, we have not had to do any type of restoration in the rocky intertidal. But if we had to, we would. Well, if it was a natural storm, no. If it was a boat grounding or an oil spill, yes.
All right, do we have any more questions?
I think you kind of touched on the last question that came up. What are the plans for capturing wildlife and
Yeah, I mean, I think if you have further questions about the plans for restoration, you can look more closely at the PRBO website, which is prbo.org, or the Fish and Wildlife website, which lists all of the different projects and places that Fish and Wildlife does work in other refuges, not just on the Farallones, but in other spots. And you can Google Farallone National Wildlife Refuge to find out more information about the Farallones. All right.
I think that's it.
If there aren't any more questions, I think we'll wrap it up.
All right.
All
Thank
right,
you for
thanks so
coming,
much.
everybody. You've been a great audience.